Okay. All right. So strength deficit's a model. I always like to preface that it is not a universal fit. And I think that's the part when we're coming up with a program that when we start to look down the rabbit hole of, oh, here's something that I could do with my teams or my athletes, it is a very situationally dependent type of model. And the example is football. It is extreme archetype driven sports. So you can look at a football team and say, okay, I have offensive and defensive linemen that are on average 300 pounds plus. I have wide receivers that can be 180 pounds and be wildly successful. And when you're looking at that, you're going, okay, I can start to categorize these guys and I can start to program around it. Hockey, basketball, lacrosse, even baseball. I don't know if it fits as conveniently into these like very rigid archetypes. And what's interesting about strength deficit in itself, it's a vector of training. So example might be triphasic, something people compare it to. That's a linear thing. It's going to go from eccentric, isometric, and concentric, right? That's a predetermined path. This isn't predetermined. This is looking from the end and working backwards, which kind of gets into this periodization model of we're either working on weaknesses and developing them in strengths like a GPP to an SPP, or we're going from the back end or where I want to be and then reverse engineering where I want to be. This is that. This is a reverse engineering approach. I know that my skill guys need to be really good in space in football. I know my big guys need to be really good in closed spaces. And what qualities do I need to develop from a biomotor, bioenergetic, and then biomechanic thing to kind of get them ready to do that? It's nice. It's convenient when I have football. And if you read the book, it is all about football. It attributes a lot of track and field. You can kind of start to see the parallels. So if I'm looking at a track and field team and I see a shot putter, okay, well, I need that person to be really good at generating force in a very small space. If I see a 100-meter sprinter or a triple jumper or a long jumper, again, they need to be very good with creating energy passively. And those models are nice and convenient. It's funny because basketball is definitely taking a lot of like interest in strength deficit. And it always comes up like, well, how would you apply this? I'm like, I don't know. And I think that's just being real with it because the opening chapter is pretty much this is not a perfect fit for everything. There's some ideas that you can think about and hopefully it gives you some point of reference to work through. And also too, I think it gives you a inclination. I think there's a bigger systemic problem of this fascination with strength or force and strength conditioning. And I don't necessarily think it's bad logic overall. When in doubt, get them stronger. But I do think there is a myopic focus over time with it, and it starts to become a crutch or a limiting factor as we go through it. So, quick breakdown of strength deficit. I'm a strength coach at Army West Point. Our team is on the precipice of getting, it's last year, right? We're going to get fired. So, I started thinking about what would I do differently if I knew that we were going to get fired at the end of this year. Because I just got fired at USC before. And I was like, I'm not going to try to get fired without going out guns blazing. So I start really thinking out loud about this idea of what would I do if I had nothing to lose? And how would I train my team differently? And what would I need to know? Right. And one of the things I've always kind of was on the verge of, but I never really had the courage to do was multi-level programming within a programming or position specific programming within one program. It's a big jump, right? And the other problem in Army I had, it wasn't this like massive football strength staff that you see a lot of the SEC or Big Ten or ACC schools. It was me and pretty much two other people. And with that being said, is a lot of these multi-level position specific programs have the benefit of having large staffs that can do a lot of different things and maybe a lot of different playing backgrounds. And I wasn't a very good football player. I played, but I wouldn't say I'm that knowledgeable about football. My assistant played baseball. My other assistant played high school football. Like I wouldn't say we're these savants when it comes down to we're not football coaches masquerading as strength coaches. We're definitively strength coaches. So with that being said, was another hurdle to jump over of I really don't know the first thing. And I've kind of like observed football and I watch it, but to be honest, if you're going to ask me to like draw up a play or, why a good football coach is good versus another or why a good offensive line is good versus another, like I'd be the first one to say like, I don't know, it just feels like a guess to me. But the point being is we had a lot of things stacked against us, but it started making me think about, well, one, I need to get better knowledge on football. Two, I need to work on what actually is a limiting factor, us being better at that at football, and not only just football, but the position we need to play. And then three, we need to be able to be really creative from a logistics perspective on optimizing our time with a limited staff. So that was kind of the premise of what we want to do with strength deficit. So, why should you consider it? This is a big point for me when I'm looking at testing and looking at developing KPIs or OKRs or anything that you feel is going to be the validator of your program, right? And I think we all have these moments of am I contributing, right? That feeling of what I'm doing actually is it doesn't really matter. And we're getting on our hill and we're dying for a cause of improving performance through strength training, through conditioning, through speed and plyometric training, all these things that we're trying to apply to our athletes. And you start to wonder about what the actual contribution is. And I think when you're going from the traditional, like, all right, what's your squat, bench, and dead, or what's your squat, bench, and clean max, or whatever the generic strength and conditioning coach substantiates their role with, I think there's an element of that has a diminishing value over time unless you get more specific to the needs of your athlete and you start talking to position coaches of why do certain people play more versus other, or what do you look for in recruits, or hey, when you talk to the athlete, what makes you feel like you're going to be successful in the field? And you start getting a different perspective and you start to become more open. And remember, the context is we don't do this, we get fired again. And I start to really think about, well, what is my job here? And I do have a feeling of like, yes, culture matters and the psychological aspect matters and relationships matter. But I think if you're good, if you're interesting, if you're smart, if you just genuinely care, if you have empathy in some way, shape, or form, then you're going to have that. And I don't want to downplay the significance of that, but I definitely think it should be there just organically if you just want to be good and you care about people and that. But the other end of it is I don't want to have that sacrifice me actually meeting some sort of objective. And that made me think about what tests were relevant, what tests are really specific, as well as not only that, what tests can actually administer. And you start to getting into these different type of advanced testing, right? Now I have force plates in all my locations at my gyms that I own. I didn't have that at the time, but even that, there's a cost to it. There's a learning curve to it. There is a time to value perspective that we need to do. What's the ROI from learning all these systems as well as trying to integrate that within a training program? The question of, do I test these things every single day or week in the locker room, or as they're coming in the weight room, do I give them autonomy to do it? Brings up a whole other series of things that you have to consider. But I started to look at it from the context, well, I'm going to do some sort of sprint test. I'm going to do some sort of med ball throw test. We usually do backwards overhead med ball toss. I'll go over that here a little bit later. And then I'll go through some sort of jump test, right? Whether it's a vertical jump or a broad jump. And I started thinking about, well, I could probably look at two ways to think about this. And I'll go through why this is important. Because you're going to be faced with the issue of a vertical jump, and that gets good until it stops getting good, right? I think we all reach this plateau with our athletes, and then we're talking about this like 0.001 difference over time, and that's hard, right? That's what you're fighting for. We're scratching, we're crawling, we're pushing through. Or you might have just the towel filled with water analogy. You've wrung that thing out as much as you possibly can, and there's no more water to pull out of there unless you really want to strain, but there might be a whole other towel filled with water. And then you start to evaluate your program. Okay, well, how does that influence what you're doing? I'm trying to get this 0.001%, wring the towel as much as I possibly can. And if I don't have at least a bigger, broader perspective of what my job is, again, we get myopically focused on what's going to move the needle there. And the story I will tell you off of that is we're doing 40-yard dash testing at USC, and we start to realize that all of our difference is coming from the first 10 yards or even the first 20 yards. The back end is no change whatsoever. And our response to this, and I'm just trying to be transparent and vulnerable here, was, oh, well, why do we need to do the back end? If all of our improvements coming in the front end, let's just focus on that. So let's only test that. And what that did was put more blinders up. And if you think about acceleration, it's inertia, it's creating force, it's longer ground contact times, it's relative strength. So we almost double down on something that we're probably already good at to begin with, and we get them stronger. And we're validated by the people that are detrained or no training experience, getting tremendous progress from that. And we get even more myopic in that focus of just getting them strong. Until you start to look back at that back half and go, wow, I'm not making any changes there. And what is the difference between the front half and the back half of a 40-yard dash? It's ground contact time, right? So if I'm spending more time on the ground, chances are I'm going to be behooved to get stronger. If I'm spending less time on the ground, getting stronger is good till it's not, and then we have to find other things like reactive strength or improving the stress shortening cycle or decreasing memorization or looking at things from just elasticity and efficiency. And that stuff is harder to do, right? That stuff is harder to do in a group. That stuff is harder to do within the context of maybe there's a little bit more risk, maybe you need a little bit more space, maybe it's just hard to do at high quality, right? There's all these things that do that. But I think the other thing with football, and this gets back into the archetype driven aspect of football, is when you are programming, you're usually programming to the lowest common denominator in any situation. And I think that's what we're doing subconsciously because that's where the most risk is. So if I look at a football team and I have a 300-pound guy and I'm thinking, oh man, I want to do more reactive strength stuff, or I want to do more or shorter ground contact stuff. Maybe I want to do a depth jump, or maybe I want to do some bounding. I probably wouldn't do it because I'm worried about the risk I would put my offensive defensive lineman in. Or maybe I want to do top end speed and I start thinking about build up runs or flying 20s, flying 40s, wicket runs, whatever's going to work on front side mechanics with shorter ground contact time. Again, subconsciously, I'm not going to do it because there's more risk associated with that guy. And I'd rather be this minimal effective dose and not get him hurt because the benefit of not getting hurt would be outweighed by whatever performance increase I would get if I was going to really push the envelope. And then we start to look at another test, and this is where strength deficit really came out. What would be the difference? And we had a jump mat at the time. So I know we have jump mats at Quinnipiac, which is kind of a good segue because it's more relatable to what my situation was in Army anyway. We had jump mats, we had 3 of them. And I was like, okay, well, let's start to look at how would I evaluate elasticity, right? So one of the original thoughts we had was let's look at a broad jump, comparatively speaking, to a penta jump or 5 consecutive broad jumps and see the difference or the ratio of the two, right? And how we can generate momentum that. Broad jumps, I think, are tough, right? I think it behooves the longer, more athletic guy. And I think there's an element of, there's a lot of skill associated with that. Where I started to other look at it too of just a lot of eccentric force. So my big guys would definitely have a lot more, I guess, negative impact if they were going to do 5 or penta jumps over and over and over again. And that had an impact on me. So I started to look at the jump mat and I started to look at counter movement jump. And obviously when we start to get past that initial threshold of our programming and we started to see a diminishing effect, if not a plateauing effect for counter movement jump or vertical jump, I wanted to look at the comparison to a 4 jump. And just jump has a 4 jump function in there. A lot of these jump mats do. Some of their times are called a extensive plyo test or a hop test. If you're like a Gary Gray enthusiast, then you understand the nomenclature and how that's a misnomer. But either way, repetitive jump test and looking at minimal ground contact time and more time in the air. And that's where RSI has come from, thinking things like looking at depth jumps or depth drops and looking at the impact on amortization on the ground. But the point being is I now wanted to look at a test that looked at their counter movement jump versus their 4 jump and seeing the difference. And what we found was that if I have a very close deficit between my counter movement jump and my 4 jump, probably means that those athletes are pretty elastic, meaning that I have a very, very high 4 jump and a very high counter movement jump. Okay, now that person's pretty elastic. Now, the question would be if I start to look at that, do I need to get this person stronger to increase their overall reserve? Or do I need to further differentiate those two? Versus my inside the box guys that I really wanted to see that difference there. That, hey, I don't necessarily care about 4 jump. I want to necessarily close that gap there. And then it started breaking it down to probably a better test, as opposed to looking at 4 jump, was looking at non-counter movement jump versus counter movement jump. And that's where the real strength deficit now is. It started to look at this concept of what is their maximal counter movement jump versus their maximal non-counter movement jump, and it starts to look at the difference. In theory, that their counter movement jump should be significantly higher than their non-counter movement jump, or this squat jump, sometimes referred to in the research. And when we start to think about those two things, when we start closing that gap of non-counter movement jump versus counter movement jump, we start to see the breadcrumb trail of the things that we do, or the breadcrumb trail of the things that we do repeatedly, right? We start to look at, oh, all I'm doing is concentrically oriented training. right? All lifts are going to have a concentric limitation. That unless we're going to do a straight eccentric lift or some sort of yielding isometric, that all lifts will have this ceiling created by concentric output. So if only thing I'm doing in a weight room is concentrically limited, that whatever I can overcome is going to be the load that I used, well, that's going to have an impact in shrinking the deficit. That my non-counter movement jump is going to be higher, relatively speaking, to my counter movement jump, and that's not good for my outside the box guys. And we'll go through that here and why that's important from a programming perspective. But again, I'm going to be limited. And I've kind of really created this very mind map type of thing. And it's a lot of thoughts all coming in one. But I want to give the whole entire context as to how this evolved and went to, because when we start getting into the actual physiology of this or the biomechanics of this or the logistics of this, you got to think about all of this stuff is just a great big experiment with everyone's jobs on the line. And I don't necessarily think that, I don't recommend to young coaches of getting this crazy and this out of all over the place. But what I would suggest is looking at your team and hopefully a different perspective, whether it's lacrosse or basketball or hockey or whatever, and start to look at where is the constraint here. And if I asked one of my players, or if I asked one of my coaches, or if I even asked a fan, like my wife would go to games, I'm like, what do you think is why we're losing? What their suggestion would be in taking that, right? Everyone's got some sort of perspective and they might be able to see it a lot more clearly than you. And then you start to break it down of like, well, what am I evaluating? Like I'm doing a great job. I'm showing up. My voice is hoarse. I can't talk at the end of the day. I feel like I can't even just function. I'm working really hard. I'm busting my ass to change these numbers and something I think is relevant or important until it's not. And that was like the other big message we talked about with the team in terms of why we're doing this. We showed our off-season videos from the year before and the year before. And I said, okay, well, let's put at the end of that, like 2 and 10, 4 and 8. Like working hard isn't the limiting factor here. It's doing something that's productive to the goal to help us perform at a higher level. And what is that? I don't know. Let's talk about it. And we had a whole bunch of back and forth. And we felt like we weren't doing enough position work. We felt like we weren't doing enough speed work that was reflective of what they're doing in practice. And that became a really different conversation. So as we start to break it down, how do we implement this? Right. So I find out, okay, hey, Brajesh, nice to meet you. I'm going to get you on the jump mat. I'm going to look at your counter movement jump versus your non-counter movement jump. Let's say that you jump 30 inches for your counter movement jump, and then you jump 25 with, let's just say 20 for its easier math, for your non-counter movement jump. Okay, so there's a 1.3 differential there. Right. So that's an interesting number. That number is meaningless unless we have some sort of context of what we're going to do with that. Okay, I know that you're more efficient utilizing the stretch shortening cycle than when you don't have it. You play defensive back. All right, I need to find out how to either enhance that stretch shortening cycle or make you more elastic, or maybe there's a ceiling there that we can start to evaluate that 30-inch jump could actually get better if I get you stronger, and it might come from improving that. Conversely, hey, Tim, nice to meet you. I find out that you have a 21-inch non-counter movement jump and a 22-inch counter movement jump. I play defensive line. And I start to evaluate me and I start to go, okay, well, what would I improve with that person? Maybe the ceiling's low, or maybe I need to improve their concentric strength. And then I think that's where it gets really fun. And I think that's where it gets into, you got to talk, you got to interview, you got to be able to get with those athletes and get to them and give them some clues. They're going to give you more insight here because it's not this very linear path off of this, because there's going to be a bunch of different perspectives. And the one thing I would say is your bias and your agendas, the things I'm good at coaching, the things I like coaching are going to influence this quite a bit unless you have a good inventory with your athletes, your staff, and other outsiders like your position coaches, your coaches, to give you what is a limiting factor. Because I could tell you this, you're going to default. You're always going to regress to your mean as a coach. You like doing certain things. You're good at certain things. You build your weight room. And one of the things I've been working on a third book, and I'm looking at that, like, what does your weight room talk about? Like, how could I define that coach based on the weight room? And I'm not saying that we should stereotype and typecast, but you can probably tell pretty quickly what that coach likes to do and doesn't like to do by just looking at the weight room or the absence of certain things or the overwhelming amount of certain things. But you can start to see, well, what is that going to impact from a logistics perspective, right? Let's say that it is that person's very eccentrically weak or eccentrically incapable and have been doing too much concentric work, but we have very limited tools or skill set or knowledge on how to improve eccentric strength. So we have to figure that out. And it's going to go down to knowledge, skill, and then motivation to change. And if we look at that and we start to think about from this context of, okay, I need to improve this. I've inventoried, I've looked at this ability to jump versus counter movement versus non-counter movement. And then I start to have to go to work. And maybe I only have 3 days to work with my team in the off season, or maybe I have 4 days. Maybe I can do a combination of turf work or inside work. Maybe I can only do inside work. Maybe I have a very limited number of tools to improve eccentric strength. Maybe I have an overwhelming number of tools to improve concentric strength, right? And we start to think about, okay, well, what can or can I do? And that's where it gets really complex. And where we're going to go from here is essentially looking at this from what I did at Army based off my situation. But the challenge of all this is starting to think about what could you do in your situation. I've seen both of your weight rooms, and I would look at this from, I have a baseball guy, I have a hockey guy, maybe I want to improve eccentric qualities here. There's going to be a solution here. It's just not going to be as the same as what I did in Army, because I had an indoor turf to run in. I had ability to divide and conquer with multiple coaches. I had athletes that obviously, like Quinnipiac, you can infinitely trust, but you have to put a lot of reliance on them. Like, this is a mutually beneficial situation that I need to trust and rely on you to make good choices from training loads and execution, because I can't see and do everything. There's just one of me and there's 100 of you. And we have to get through this eccentric oriented workout. And I'm trying to regulate this from a work to rest ratio so we don't put ourselves unnecessarily at risk. All right, testing, gone through that. Force plate versus jump mat. I do think there's a testament, and B, we talked about this a little bit, of now what I'm burdened with what I know now, that I would say this, a force plate, force deck, Hawkins, whatever have you, they're going to give you some more metrics within this. And I think you could further evaluate those questions I was asking before of like, is it a ceiling problem or is it an overdoing certain things problem? And one of the things that I really now understand with the benefit of force plates is concepts like reactive strength index or RSI. How much time are you spending on the plate versus the air? Which is a pretty good question to ask. And with that being said, is how does that correlate to things like elasticity? Then conversely, how does that impact from a concept like impulse and how much force I can create respective of time? And if I can produce a lot of force, but it takes me a long time to do it, versus I don't produce a lot of force, but I can do it very quickly, and I can start to further elucidate what I need to do, that's a really big step. But it's all about, okay, well, what can I do to make a change today? If you have a jump mat, I would say invest time into understanding, looking at, hey, I want to look at their eccentric versus their concentric ability. And maybe I look at a non-counter movement jump versus a counter movement jump. Maybe you look at a counter movement jump versus a depth jump. Maybe you look at a counter movement jump versus a fore jump. Or maybe you do all of them and you start to pick out where my outliers are. What is my standard distribution chart, right? So I have my elite level and I have my baseline level within my sample, my hockey team of 30 guys, and I look at them across the spectrum and I start to think, okay, well, they're really good at counter movement jump. They're not. They're good at fore jump. They're not. They're good at depth jump. They're not. And I start to break that down. But as you go further and further, more information can be helpful or maybe even a crutch. And what I've learned is a jump mat is a great tool. It's a great tool if it's very minimal staff to athlete ratio. So you're 1 in facing 30, because they can do it quickly. They can do it without much education. Like, you don't have to go through a very elaborate process for a force deck or Hawkins. And it doesn't have all this information overload. But I would say over time, you might get to a point where you're like, okay, I want to learn more about this. And you start maybe looking at other metrics like iso thigh pull and a hop test, looking at how much time do you spend on the plate and RSI, comparatively speaking, to a non-counter or counter movement jump versus what they call a hop test. Maybe look at single leg versus the other leg. We talked about this. Now we get into the ratios. So we're going to create some sort of continuum here, that when we start to break down a inside the box athlete versus an outside the box athlete, so a wide receiver, defensive back, running back, slot back for outside the box, O-line, D-line, tight end, fullback, maybe these like defensive ends, linebackers for our inside the box guys. It really comes down to one needs to be really good in space and one needs to be good in small spaces, right? They're in a wrestling match and they're basically a bunch of cheetahs running around a field, or gazelles running around a field. So that cheetah, that gazelle, needs to have a lot of elasticity. Because the other thing that we find with these perimeter athletes, they're Running distance is much better, much higher. Like a lot of these athletes are running miles. They're not running yards, they're running miles. And their efficiency from an economy or running perspective, looking at like a soccer player and they're running throughout the course of a match or a game, is all this huge amount of distance, but it's broken up into this small chunk of sprint, maybe higher intensity run, jog, and then looking at a walk. Same thing for these skill guys. Like they're basically doing a soccer match every single practice, miles and distributing amongst all these things, but they need to be able to turn it on. And what I would say is the more efficient, the more passive energy transfer, the less mechanical energy transfer is why these athletes can be able to go a 24 period practice in periods of 5 minutes. And they can do special teams in the middle of practice, at the end of practice. They can do 7-on-7 one-on-ones, running 30 to 60 yards at a clip multiple times in a 5 minute period with not losing much speed, is because their overall efficiency. And that kind of gets into the why the increasing the deficit or focusing more on eccentric. It's actually less about now looking at this from, oh, well, what is their common movement jump and their ability to do that, and more about their economy of energy production during a workout or practice. They're just not going to use as much mechanical energy. Versus an inside the box guy, we want them to be able to overcome someone else's body mass. We want them to be really good in a small confined space. So I want them strong. I want a high cross-section muscle area. I want to utilize a really high amount of mechanical energy production. And that comes from just getting them in really good shape. But they're still anaerobic. They're just now focused on a different thing. And then I start to think about my training and I start to look at, okay, I might have these people that don't fit conveniently into these boxes. And I start to ask questions about, do I start to push them and nudge them into that? Because I'll just tell you the breakdown from here, that I'm going to do things that are going to be more elastic in nature for outside the box guys automatically. I'm going to do more front side mechanics. I'm going to do open drills. I'm going to do ground contact time plyos that are shorter than higher ground contact time plyos that are longer. So bounding, depth jumps, rudiment, extensive plyos, things that are reactive in nature. Versus our inside the box guys, it's going to be a lot of low gear work, very high force, slow, a lot of concentric overload. Maybe we utilize accommodating resistance. We'll do our sprint work from a static position. We'll do our med ball and plyo work from a static position. It's going to be a lot of concentric orientation. If we're going to break it down from the sprint archetype, our skill guys, we're going to look at that back 20, and our inside the box guys, or big guys, we're going to look at that first 10. And we're going to really dive into that. We're going to combine those metrics to really allow for this whole profile. And then we're going to go through we already went through the testing, but then we got to look at this. And I'll finish off with this, and I'll take a break here. I know I've been rambling and rattling off a lot, but it's got to correspond. And this concept of dynamic correspondence, I think, is lost so much when we talk about, when I get in the weeds on this training, right? And this is like, let's get our head above water right now. Let's pause for a second. Let's get our head above water. Let's understand the big picture. Let's start to see what the goal of all this is, right? Can we score more points than our opponent? That's it, right? That's the game. So if we don't have our athletes in a position to do that, whether it's an injury risk profile or whether it's our guys are completely bonked by the time we get to the fourth quarter, or if it's something else of like, they can't change direction or they don't open their hips one way versus the other. They're stiff. They're unreliable on the field. That's where I think you got to come back together and you start to say, okay, is this actually helping? And I'm improving the deficit or I'm decreasing the deficit. I'm looking at this one way or the other. I want to come back to saying, is this actually applying? And one of the things that I think is probably most important here is when you have these mini tests within your training, right? Let's just say that you do open drills or games and you start to look at that, like how organic are they in that situation? And a lot of times people say, well, you can't train that. I disagree. I think we can train the qualities, the biomechanics. We can put them in a position to be better, right? It's all entropy, right? That if they don't have the prerequisite range of motion, they don't have the prerequisite bioenergetics, they don't have the prerequisite strength, force, elastic strength, or concentric strength to be able to do that stuff, they won't have it. So we're just reducing down these small digestible parts and giving them in pieces, and they're having to put it back together in an open drill or a chaotic drill. And you look at that from an inventory of did everything at that point to help prepare that athlete for something that we couldn't prepare for. And if they don't have prerequisite range of motion, if they don't have the elastic strength, if they don't have the bioenergetic capacity to do it, then you didn't do your job. and I got to go back to the drawing board. And it might mean I just spent too much time on one. I got too pragmatic. I just focused on one thing too long. It might mean that I need to introduce this stuff earlier or more within the training program. And that's part, I think, is the part where you start to break it down. And I know we all have situations with football, like we were watching player-led practice, or basketball, they're doing like 7-on-7 or 5-on-5. They're doing these things all the time. And you watch it and you see these guys either performing better or performing worse. And they'll tell you, they'll feel frustrated training. You can see their body language of training because they don't understand, they don't see the resonate. And I think that's your indicator that you need to come back, get your head above water, and look at this objectively and saying, I need to make sure that I'm putting these athletes in a better position to perform at a higher level. And that part is often lost. And it's not getting like, all right, man, I'm just going to do a Verkhoshenki and Yesis type of overloaded SPP type of movement. It is, how is it applying? And I have these like micro indicators as I'm going. And I look at my testing, and I can look at the rate of change, the amount of change, and I can start to do that. So back to the original point, it's not a linear vector for me. And I know this kind of feels like, wow, it's a lot of chaos, and it's like, I can't really pull a lot out from that directly just yet. But what I would want you to do right now, and this is what I mean when I opened up with, it's not a perfect model. It's not a simple solution. Like I can apply this to football pretty quickly, but I can't do this to hockey as quickly. I can't do this to basketball or soccer or lacrosse as quickly. But what I would argue is there's probably something that you can look from a path or a vector that we can start to look at from where do these athletes need to be when it comes down to that first game all the way to the last game, and start to figure out, do I need to improve that deficit, decrease that deficit? Do I need to focus on that with one group or versus the other? And you can start to form better plans. Pause right there. Questions, comments, or anything you guys want me to go further in on? I know that was probably pretty chaotic and sporadic, so I apologize for that.
Have you always done more individualized programming like this, at least when you're at the college sector?
It's a great question. So I think it's a very interesting. So put your realness hat on. Everything's individualized as long as I have different weights for you. So if I'm writing the same program and you're all using different weights, we all have different programs, quote unquote. That's individualized. To be honest, at the end at Army, we had 7 programs running at the same time. I had athletes I really trusted, and I had coaches that I felt like, myself included with them, we could really manage this properly. At USC, I was responsible for writing the programs. We didn't do that. We basically actually went the extreme opposite way of what, and our head coach was like, as long as our shoes ties and our feet are pointing in the right direction, we should be able to win more games than we lose. Keep it simple, stupid. And we just kind of like, let's focus on a big 4 every day, a push, pull, a hinge, and squat, and just do that violently and try to develop this top down. Our best players are doing it, so our walk-ons and our freshmen should be committed to doing it. It was more of the symbolism of it. I just didn't have that luxury in Army, right? The dynamic, and I worked at Springfield College as well. So, one of the things you realize quickly when you have a very captive audience that's smart, intelligent, and capable, and really motivated, is it's actually a decrement if you don't leverage them. USC, I don't need to get in the way of that, right? I don't need to be more creative or have a lot more. My skill set isn't as valuable there. My people skills is more valuable. Can I motivate a guy who's not motivated to do something at a high level consistently? But Army, I have a very motivated audience. So my skill now is, and I thought I was much more valuable at Army than I was at USC, to be completely transparent, because I can really I can throw the whole full arsenal at them. So 7 programs, like you look at it, there's a lot of things going on at once. I have my freshmen, sophomores out there in the field with one coach. I have my juniors and seniors out here on the field with another coach. I'm inside with all of our offensive and defensive linemen, and I'm running through 2 different programs simultaneously with them. The funniest story, and this would be a really, really good one to hopefully settle this in, but we always finish our summer with what we call position-specific conditioning. And I'll just say it simply, with our inside the box guys, it's strongman. Like, we're going to do a strongman circuit. And then our outside the box guys, we just did so much tempo work. We utilize a high-low pretty much all year till we get to July. Then it gets into, we just got to get ready for 6 days in a row of practice. So we start to get into open drills, a lot of them, and every day it's some sort of competitive game type of scenario. So imagine one half the field going through the strongman circuit with 75 guys, and they're just getting absolutely throttled. And like, throwing up while pushing a sled. My coach is out there screaming, like, finish. Then on the other side, it looks like Top Gun volleyball scene. They're just high fiving, having the best time ever. No shirt, just having a blast. And with that being said, is I don't need to motivate those guys over there. Like those guys are having a great time and working their asses off. And with that being said, is I don't have bad coaches, but I could put my inexperienced coach and facilitate that versus I can have my dogs over with me just, hey, we got to get after these guys. We got an objective to do. We want to get through 30 drills of strongman, accommodating 30 minutes of continuous work within a 60-minute period. It's going to take all of our effort and all of our might. And I would always solicit whoever coach was like around in the building. I'm like, can you come down and just within legal confines of compliance, but maybe give a little bit of help and effort here? And that would be the part. So with that being said is no, I did not do individualized programs everywhere, but I had a very ideal situation in Army where I had a lot of support from the top down and I had coaches that I could do that, but I had athletes that, I mean, I could just show them the board at a certain point and that'd be good. And I think that was the other issue for me. I don't want to say I got bored, but imagine you're doing the most comprehensive, elaborate program and the kids are really smart and they can do it. And you're like, oh, am I that necessary anymore? Not saying that wasn't as valuable, but like, you feel like you're the smartest person in the room at all times because you know your contact matter more than they do until you realize they know it just as well as you do and they're very capable. And I don't know, I mean, Burjesh and I have talked about this of like how we've evolved as people and our interest levels. And I don't know, I struggle with that. I think I was probably like, I wanted to be more valuable again, to be honest. I'm not saying that I wasn't invaluable, but there was a moment where I was like, I don't know, I kind of like, feel like this stuff can cure cancer if I figure it out, you know, and I wanted that opportunity again, but within the team sector, and especially at Army, was like I felt like everyone was pretty locked in and capable. And the more I'm reading the board, the more I'm just kind of like filling the air with noise and not necessarily like, okay, I'll just shut up and get out of the way. You guys got this, go. There's a really good line from Rick Majerus's book, My Life on a Napkin, where he talked about he realized he reached his pinnacle as a coach when Andre Miller in the Final Four was like, sit down, we got this. And he's like, it was 4 years of developing these guys, and these guys are now better coaches than me, and I can sit back and relax. And I think that's what we're all striving for as coaches. We have athletes that are autonomous and capable, but there's also an element too of like, I don't know, we're human. We want to be valuable and we want to have an impact on our environment. And I was 30 something at the time and I wanted that, I don't know, validation and that responsibility and that onus. So that probably was a big influence of why I left, but that feeling of like, okay, we did it, man. And then the results spoke for itself. We had a great year that year and we ended up ending a 15-year streak and everything's been good since.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I enjoyed the pieces that came with that.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I can go on some tangents.
Yeah. I think it helped me kind of understand that I have some teams that are ready for more individualized programming and would highly benefit from it, where we have full, like everybody's bought in from the coaches to the players to the point where like we talk about every day, like what are you seeing on the field if I can't make it for practice? It's tough when you have 6 teams. You can't do the same thing or I just can't give the same time to all 6 of the teams that I want to be able to give the time to. And some of the teams, like my men's tennis team, for example, still struggling with the character culture kind of pieces. And so like for them, we just need to work on the foundation pieces before we can even implement other things. But with my women's soccer team, like I try to do individualized programming for we'll say like the elite group, like you had mentioned before, but I feel like I could give them more. And so I think that might be a next step.
So I plug here, but the third book is done, and it's all off that simple question of, and because here's a scenario. I'm now writing private training programs along with writing group programs. So I have 600 members plus at all 3 of my gyms, all doing group exercise, and we have probably 100 personal training clients that have individualized, customized programs. So our 600 members are doing this, not generic, but this, we call it the train ride type of approach of you're getting on the train, you're still going to point B of getting stronger, faster, looking better, feeling better, but we're getting on a train and it's going to go at the pace it wants to do versus personal training. You're just taking Uber where you want to go. There's no stopping. There's no starting. It's a linear path. We know what you want. Let's get there. And I had to face this problem because I really thought my group programs were really good. And when I start writing a program one-on-one, okay, what do I do differently? Right? Like, well, this person they're paying more, they have more direct need, they have a desire to change more. So I started thinking out loud about like, well, what would be the tangible difference? And I started subconsciously like, we'll just do group exercise. It's better. Like that program is as good, and you get the benefit of company, and you don't have to rely on me for conversation the whole time. And maybe I struggled with the notion that it was worth that much more. But then it started making me think about, well, what am I doing? What am I compromising with a group program than I am with an individual program or a more customized program? And when you start to break it down, and I talked about it before, we always program to the lowest common denominator in a group of the one that has the highest risk or the one that's going to be the least probable success with a program. We focus on that. And then sometimes it's another approach of it's the, survive or get out of the way, the adapt or perish folks of like, I'm going to program to the highest person in the room and everyone else's responsibility to try to get to their level.
Mhm.
And it might be too much for pretty much everyone else, but it's perfect spot for our elite level guys. And then we look at the final level. Sometimes we just kind of fall in the middle, and hopefully we're hitting as much of the middle of that bell curve as possible. Versus individualized training, you got to throw all that out. You got to start with them, right? And we got to start with what their needs are from start to finish. So if you're going to make a customized program, you got to ask yourself, am I just going to add more volume or decrease the rest time, or I'm just going to double down on things that we're already doing, or is it going to be more customized to that person and their needs, right? They're getting to a senior year, and I think we've all kind of been in that role of working as a support with someone else's program, and then the athletes come in like, what do we got this year? Oh yeah, we're going to do this program again. That feeling of like, well, it's all about execution. It's all about how well we do this, right? And I don't think there's a bad side of that, especially in certain sectors. And, you talked about your tennis team of like, it doesn't matter what we do. We just need to do something really well.
Mhm.
Versus, okay, I've had a senior here and they busted their ass and they've done a really good job. She deserves something unique to her to have the best senior year possible. But that could come at the compromise or sacrifice of the rest of the group. And it could come at me having to coach multiple programs and being less than for certain groups, right? So let's say that you, like one of the examples I talk about a lot within the logistics of strength deficit is if you read triphasic, you're going to get the French contrast training. I think the notion of it makes sense, but the logistics of it suck, right? It's a lot of exercises supersetted with a group that usually most weight rooms aren't congruent for that, right? So we start to think about, well, okay, what would I use that in a scenario for? Maybe a elite group, like a small sector of my soccer team that could handle that kind of overall stress and volume. But where
Mhm.
would I put that in my room? How would I adjust that? So I think these, like, you're always in this intersection of compliance and execution and doing the best possible program for them. But I would say this, it's about having a really hard conversation with all athletes in the group that certain athletes I trust to be able to execute in a program. But the ironic part is when you make it to a certain level, I have to be less focused on you than the other group that needs a lot more of my individual attention because I trust you. I know that you're going to get there. I know
Right.
that you're going to be able to execute on this. And we had a whole thing about before we'd go into every off season who's in what program. And I would have to lay it out of you had this many missed reps, you had this many things that we had to get on your ass about being on time and doing it right. You
Mhm.
can't do a higher level program. If you're showing up 5, 10 minutes late and we're gonna do 10 sets of three on power clean at 90%, you're done. You're not gonna make it. That
Yeah.
program doesn't help you. You're here because of your actions and the things that you don't do well. And what I'm imploring you to do is take that personally and fight like hell to say, okay, you're wrong. I can buy in. I can make this the best year of my career, and then I can go ahead and move into that higher level program. But that program's not effective to you because you don't have your life in order. It's all contingent upon how you having everything in the right place. And to be honest, like you're looking at that group, it was like a lot more frequent. So our elite group, we reserve for our higher performing guys, not our best athletes, not our best players, but the best performers in the weight room was we're just trying to squeeze out that towel as much as possible. And we had very short mesos, 2 weeks tops. We're really cranking on as much volume. And I had a conversation with Iowa about this of like, I think you should probably cut back down on your exercise inventory and do a couple things really well. And it's like this, I have this philosophy of once I know what I need to do, I don't do anything else. Like if you tell me I need to increase the deficit and I know these three things are going to do that better than anything else, I get blinders on, right? And the analogy I tell people all the time, it's like I'm at a roulette table. I know that's going to land on 32. I'm not hedging my bets. There's a magnet under 32. Someone gave me an inside tip. I'm putting all my money on that. And a lot of times people get a little gun shy when they get that opportunity in front of them, right? And if you ever look at investing, like they got insider trading and they might be a little bit apprehensive or the consequence associated with that. But the ones that are just absolutely savages, the billionaires, the ones that have houses in Greenwich, they don't worry about that stuff. They deal with the consequences later. And the same thing with training. Like I've done all my testing, I've done all my interviewing, I've done everything I need to do to get as much information on that person as possible. I don't hedge my bets. I just lock in on that. Okay, we're gonna do 10 sets of 3 at 90% on clean. We're gonna do weight release hooks here. We're gonna do this in a complex in block 3. You have to recover. Like if you don't have a good training day, I'm gonna blame you on this one, and you need to be able to take that. Like you need to hydrate, you need to get your protein before, you need to get carbohydrates before, you need to have your carbohydrates and protein afterwards. You need to get 8 hours of sleep. Can you do that? Like rise to the occasion. Don't back down. And that's where it gets like a really like I find I don't know. I find I get myself really excited in those situations because that pressure is privilege mentality of I'm putting the responsibility and the onus on you to rise to this occasion. And if you can't handle it, that's okay. But just to give you a full heads up, I'm going to be on you this whole time. And if you can't handle that, just let me know now. And it's funny. It's funny to see people's response. Everyone will always say like, "Oh, I can handle it." And okay, well, remains to be seen.
We'll
And
see.
then when you're in bullets are flying, you're obviously a human. You're like, no, a psychopath working with Ivan Dragoff in the offseason, get ready to beat Rocky. Like you're going to have compassion, right? Like life is hard, and being a college athlete is hard. But that dynamic of that, and there was like a funny moment with one of our guys in the elite group, and I still work with him this day. Talk about like building like long relationships. He's a paying client for my digital programming. And man, he was missing this 90% clean mark. We're doing doubles, like 10 sets of 2. He was missing this third set. He was missing it. I'm like, what the hell are we going to do for the next 8 sets? Like, what are we going to do now? Like, what did you not sleep? He's like, I slept 9 hours. I'm like, I don't believe it. It was a quality sleep. And we're going back and forth. I'm like, all right, we're cutting it. We're cutting it. And you could tell he was so mad. And he came back in the next like Thursday because we were doing like a Tuesday workout. I mean, he was like, hair was on fire. He was just so mad. Like, just that pressure. It was an amazing thing to watch of like, we had a conversation about why this is important and what you need to do outside of here. And I would tell you that situation was an anomaly. If I try to do that at USC or even Georgia Tech, they'd be like, all right, cool, I'm done. I'll see you. See you. Have a great Tuesday. And that's okay too. Like, all right, I just misread the situation. My knowledge in that moment was limited. I had a perspective that they really wanted to do that. And they didn't. They didn't care in the first place because they didn't see the value of it versus in that situation, Army. Like, I put it on such a high pedestal, and this is going to be the lock and key to all of our hopes and dreams. And they ate it up, man.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Do you guys want to break down like a kind of mock test for Quinnipiac with maybe some athletes here? I think that'd be a fun little exercise, B.
Yeah, that'd be great. Anybody
Okay.
get some data?
Any teams coming up here? So we got winter sports wrapping up here the next month. What's a traditional like April look like for basketball?
Depends on the year. I mean, so women's basketball, they lost, so they're going to start a little bit sooner than our men's team. So we've probably usually get anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks of training in. And it's pretty much a GPP kind of general prep, just trying to get them back into training shape per se. So a lot of eccentrics, a lot of connective tissue work, just trying to build some training capacity and training volume back up because near the end of the season, our training is so minimal. So we've got to be able to get our specific work capacity back up for training. So that's what we'll typically do, train 4 days a week. 1 day a week, we'll just do some competition type work, split the team up in 2. And that kind of leads us into our summer, which is when most of them are here. And then that'll be a little bit more early off season, progressing to some late off season, a little bit more speed, power type work. So right now, April's really, really general, isometric emphasis, eccentric, just really trying to create some positional awareness and building up some tissue tolerance before we load them a little bit further in the summer.
Which kind of gets into here's a moment to evaluate like almost a SWOT analysis of what you did in season. Because as soon as we get in the roll of things, we start to default. Like we start to okay, I know I can be successful with this anytime, right? So if we go back to Andrea's and Dr. Kramer's nonlinear periodization, like oh we're gonna do this strength workout, at least once every 2 weeks. I know that like that routine of all. And I don't know if you follow that during in season, but we can start to look at the inventory of things we do from a post season test, so to speak. And what I would say is like looking at a counter movement jump versus a squat jump or a non-counter movement jump right now as an evaluation for what did we get focused on in season and where is that ratio between the two, as well as what I also find interesting is what is the transmutative effects of doing a connective tissue type of focus workout, right? So let's say that you're doing extensive plyos in this phase, a lot of positional isos, yielding probably in nature, maybe doing a little bit more isolation work, looking at the calf, Achilles, maybe the knee. What is the transmutative effect from their ability to transfer that to a stretch shortening cycle? And you can start to look at it from, oh, wow, this might actually take 6 to 8 weeks of actual time to this manifest, which is also an interesting thing to kind of like wrap your head around, because this stuff is always down before it's up. And when it actually starts to go into fruition, what do you need to do at that point? I find that part is also a really cool thing. So inventorying where you're at postseason from a non-counter movement jump, just 3 jumps of each. Like, all right, jump on the mat. Let's see what your counter movement jump is, 3. Let's relax for a couple seconds. Let's do your hands on your waist. Squat down to a quarter squat, pause for 3 seconds, jump up as high as you can, land, and then looking at the difference between the two. All right, what is that ratio between the two? Traditionally, postseason, I find that ratio or that strength deficit gets shrunken. Right, we see a lot higher non-counter movement jumps than counter movement jumps, which is always fun and ironic because you're just jumping and running so much. But from just weight room stuff or just getting more tighter and less efficient from utilizing passive energy from the stress shortening cycle or even the series elastic component that shrinks organically. And then you, okay, well, what do I need to change from here? Okay, maybe I do a lot of positional isos, yielding and focus, maybe some rudiments, some extensive plyos, some low amplitude stuff. Or maybe I start to get a little bit more eccentric emphasis and start to look at extended eccentrics. And that's the part too where the thing can kind of get crazy of, oh, well, do I need to get weight release hooks? Or do I need to do really high level depth jumps? Like, or you can just do a 5-second eccentric. Like, that's something too. Like, right, the work effect of a rep takes 8 seconds, so to speak. Can we spend more of that time in the strong contraction type, whether it's eccentric or isometric? And that part is just allocating more of your natural resources where you should be inherently stronger eccentrically than you are concentrically. It's not until strength coaches come in there and screw it all up that we make them less than in eccentric and isometric. So, that dynamic there too. But that'd be a fun one to hear about, just doing a quick test on that and then looking at how long does it actually take to change?
So we don't usually use the mats like with basketball. We use the Vertec, right? And so we'll go approach jump versus regular jump, right? And so our approach is where we kind of measure elasticity versus just a regular counter movement jump. And what we've actually noticed is that after a season, their approach jump is higher because of the amount of elastic work they've done from sprinting and running and jumping continuously in their sport. After an off season, the ratio between the two is typically smaller because we won't spend as much time doing reactive work knowing that they're going to get so much of that stimulus when they play. Yeah. So we'll focus more typically on trying to develop the static part and getting them a little bit stronger because we know all their stiffness is going to come from play. The other thing too is in basketball, there is very little traditional off season now because they practice year round. So it's very different than probably even 5 to 6 years ago when we didn't have the opportunity to work with coaches. Now they have the opportunity to work with coaches up to 4 hours a week, and so that kind of throws a wrench into a typical off-season plan because they're playing year round. Granted, it's not to the amount of volume that it is in season, but they're still getting that similar stimulus and they're being coached.
Yeah.
So
usually means less like off-season conditioning work, all right? They're allocated off-season conditioning. On the approach jump, do you have them jump off of 2 feet or do you allow them to jump off of 1 foot if they prefer?
Their preference.
Okay.
So some will jump off of 2, some will jump off of 1, and it's not standardized, but it's their preference. So I'd want to jump because that's a skill in and of itself, right? Like so in the off season, we would teach them how to jump off of 1, teach them off of 2. But again, it's what they do preferentially when they play so much.
Yeah. So I find that's like the skill component. Like if I'm trying to like break down this, all right, how do I extrapolate information from this? There's a huge skill component in approach jump. And especially if you get into obviously you don't do it, but we got to go off of 2 feet. Like you approach, jump off 2 feet so we can standardize this more. I just found more, I guess, I'm more overall like success when evaluating the information off of a non-counter movement jump versus a counter movement jump, or even like that's why I don't do depth jump either, because I think there's a skill component there as well. Even four jump on the jump mat, I found people miss the mat all the time, and that became so frustrating.
Huge
Yeah,
skill component in the four jump. Hockey
which
will do non-con movement jump and regular jump consistently.
okay. Do you find anything of like that nature? Because that's just pushing, right? For like, not a whole lot of eccentric stress in hockey. Do you find those guys do a lot of have a big non-counter movement jump, relatively speaking, a counter movement jump?
They do, especially in season, because of the amount of skating that they're doing and just pure impulse work that they do from skating. So we'll usually have the differences up like on our spreadsheet when they start to fill things in, and they'll ask those kinds of questions. And I'm like, you know what? Your non-counter movement jump is going to be a little bit higher now in season. I think Spencer asked that same question probably a month or so ago, like because the amount of static-based work that they're doing, it's just pure strength-based work that they're doing.
Yeah. And there's also interesting too it feels like everything's cyclical at this point, but the renaissance of isometric work. I remember you were doing this work at Holy Cross, like not ahead of the curve, but like, all right, this is like a good opportunity, and I feel like it went out of popularity, and here we go. Here it's all coming back around, But it makes sense.
Everything always comes back around, right?
Yeah.
If you've been in the game long enough, you start to realize that nothing's really new. It's just it's your ability to apply concepts in different situations with the population that you have.
And I also find it's interesting too and this was something it's happening quite a bit. It's the realization that doing, just a full eccentric, isometric, concentric lift in season is really challenging, and you can have much more success with isolation work or a isometric. And then it's like kind of diverging into two different paths of like, oh yeah, I'm an ISO guy. Like, and then I find other people are like, I just do machines in season. And it's like, oh, okay. Like, and it's just where you can be more successful with, or what's going to be less friction with your athletes if they walk in like, damn, I got front squats like with a 5-0 exo tempo for 5 sets of 6. Like, that doesn't seem very, very beneficial to me at this moment versus, are you guys just doing a static overcoming ISO, pushing on this bar as hard as you can into the rack, or on the other end, like you're just going to do a hack squat on this hack squat machine over here, just easier, right? And you get this concept. But I wonder, from an isolation standpoint, or there's always going to be some sort of residual off that, like good from a training stress standpoint and developing and maintaining force output. But, over time we get caught up in what we can be more successful with short term, but there's always a long-term effect that we need to evaluate just as much. And I think that's the part for me with strength deficit, was this realization of like everything I'm doing has some sort of concentric governor on it. And you see non-counter movement jumps just way higher for our perimeter athletes that need to be good in space than they should be. Like our strength deficits were not very good. And we had a lot of, what I call, hard work guys at Army, of like, they could easily be a Division III kid and pursuing exercise science like the rest of us, but they still had to play Ohio State, and they still had to, play a Division I football game and go against some of the best athletes in the entire world. And it's like, all right, well, I can double down on this. They love squat, benching, and cleaning, so I can get this there. I'm going to win them over quickly if I just hammer that. Or, yeah, we're going to have to do some complexes. We're going to throw weight release hooks in there. We'll use some oscillating bars. We'll do more bounding, depth jumps. Like, that was the part when I started like asking our skill guys to bound, like going from right to left in a linear fashion or laterally, and just watching how poor they were absorbing and utilizing that eccentric energy. It's an overloaded eccentric if you really think about it. And their reactive strength was just really poor. And it's like, okay, well, let me look at strength deficit again. And oh, wow, okay, their non-counter jumps are pretty high, relatively speaking. No wonder why they can't absorb and create energy efficiently going into the next step. And why when they run, they look like they're basically just like Fred Flintstone, just gliding foot one front of the other. They have no front side lift. We never practice or rehearse it or work on any top end speed, and the reactivity sucks. And no wonder why when someone's doing a go route, they just run straight and they just basically blow them by 20 yards. Like, wow, okay, I got some ownership to take on here.
That's awesome. Does anybody else have questions for Tim or examples they want to share, and then I get his opinion?
I've got a couple questions. The first one relates to just kind of the protocol of testing the strength deficit. Like, I know you said you would have them, do all the jumps, do all the counter movement, then do all the non-counter movement. Have you tried anything like, I know how B will do it with the hockey teams. We'll do a counter movement jump on Monday, and then non-counter movement on Wednesday. Do you think that would change things necessarily, or alter the deficit ratios?
I would say whatever you think you'd be more successful with, right? We all have a bunch of stuff we got to worry about in our day, and not trying to overthink that. I mean, there's always going to be like best practice and some sort of research guy with a lab coat. Like that's not a great research design or methods, but I would come in like I've done this in a locker room, bare feet, and like I got numbers, and from there it's like hopefully it was reliable enough. And I find that part of like just give me 6 jumps, 3 counter movement, 3 non-counter movement is easier for me. But I don't think it's a bad thing to do them separated on each day. Like as long as you're being consistent with it and you're just trying to find the information, like and try to keep it as reliable as possible. And that part is easily the biggest hurdle. Like because we can fight this all day of like what's best practice, and then a lot of us end up doing nothing. I'd rather you do something than nothing.
Cool. What about like upper body stuff? I know it's probably you'd probably have to get a little creative with some of it, but I'm just, trying to think if there would be any reason to test strength deficit for upper body, or if you've tried something along those lines.
No, because I think all force generates from the ground up, to be honest, in sport. Like I don't want to diminish the value of upper body power, or upper body just ability, but it's all coming from the ground up, right? So the more efficient you are from a closed kinetic chain perspective, the better. I would look at more structural balance, to be honest, upper body wise. Like, can you push as much as you pull, and having not having reciprocal inhibition when you're throwing or passing or making contact, especially in contact sports, having enough upper body mass to take on the blow or the shock. That's an underrated aspect. It is kind of funny though. B, I don't know if you were ever at the CSCCA, but Michael Johnson spoke one time, and he's like, the only thing that really matters for speed development is bench press, which is like probably one of the funniest things I've ever heard in my life. And there was like several strength coaches that just got up and walked out. I was like, well, Pop Bregfair is one of the best sprinters of all time, saying only thing that matters is bench press. Like, I mean, granted, yeah, it's like I get it's sacrilegious for us, but I mean, the dude was unbelievable. So
genetics play a part.
Yeah. But I would say just like using logic and intuition, and plus there's so many tests you can probably be successful with. Like you only have so many bullets in the chamber to test your guys in a given week versus getting good training and keeping their interest. If they feel like they're lab rats, eventually they'll start to become disinterested, or if they don't really see that information manifesting or anything and influencing their programming or giving them some sort of feedback, they resent it over time, right? The extreme examples of it be like in NFL, where you have teams that are very proactive on trying to test everything and anything under the sun, and the players become very creative at getting out a test. And that part is like where you want to avoid, right? So, yeah, as Charlie Warngraf would say, training is rehab, rehab is training. Like same thing, training is testing, and testing is training. That just put it in the workout. Like you already know, you see it right there. Like a quick one would be looking at VBT. If you're doing that, like how fast can you move 85%, or stuff that Brian Mann's doing from a 1RM with Gym Aware or whatever else you can look at. Like that stuff's all there. You're just gonna have to be more creative at finding that within the workout.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any kind of questions?
I just had one question. I saw that a couple days ago you posted on X just like a little thread about highlighting in your training lower body in the off season, and then highlighting heavier upper body in season. Can you just like describe kind of your thinking? And
think about it in the context. I work with contact sports, predominantly football. So a lot of these guys are going to have a psychological view of what is good and bad strength conditioning, and they'll have these like indicators. Football is going to be bench press. It really will be. And especially in these football's tough. You got one Saturday a week, and then you have 5-6 days of just basically you're just getting crushed. And there's a lot of psychological games here as well. You're second or third on the depth chart, and you can stay there forever. And there's no real rhyme or reason as why you move up or down. It's a lot of perceived subjectivity. So a lot of these guys and they're males, and they're in a very vulnerable age. So a lot of these guys are internalizing a lot of this stuff. And you see it come out in the weight room. Their bench goes down because we don't prioritize it as much. And they're like, this program sucks. Like, this program sucks. And it's not you that's the problem. It's everything in their life is. So I always found in season wise, like I'm gonna, and it was intentional of when I know that inevitable week that we have a bad week, we lose to someone, and they're gonna start to like point fingers and try to cast blame, that I'm gonna withhold upper body work. And we just talk about develop horsepower in the off season, and then who cares, vanity in season? Like it's just, haze in the barn at this point if we did our job. Not saying that we didn't train lower body, but I really put a lot of emphasis. Like it's the point of, and this is another concept that I've been working through, of there's no such thing as tertiary or accessory exercise. If it's necessary, it's necessary. So if you push it, you got to pull it. If you do something upper body, you should do lower body. Just changing the A, right? So if you classify A1 or 1A, like whatever that first exercise is, I just flip it, right? So off season, it's hinge and squat is my A1. In season, it's a vertical pull and horizontal press is A1. So if I got those 2 days, and I just kind of focus on it. I'm still doing a lower body push, whether it's a restricted movement because I don't have availability to a barbell and I have to do a dumbbell, like it's fine. I just put a governor on there. And that part is like push as hard as you possibly can with those dumbbells. Whatever you can hold on those split squats or that front squat or that goblet squat. But bench press, we have a lot higher ceiling because we can load it up with the barbell. And that's kind of the focal point. And for whatever reason, that method over 15 years of doing that football and seeing guys, it's kind of like I don't know, I feel a little bit misleading on this, but we always set PRs on bench press and pull up in season because we just didn't do it as much in the off season. It wasn't as much of a focus, or I didn't celebrate it. I would do more dumbbell bench variations or push-up variations or dips or everything else under the sun, and then get away from the barbell. And then when we get in season, it's like, all right, like this is that time. And Mike actually had a great, I think it was like early mid 2000s, of the progressive rep scheme where you're adding a rep to a certain intensity over 4 weeks. So you put 85% on the bar and you should be able to hit that for roughly, let's just say 8 reps. So you do week 1, 4 reps, week 2, 5 reps, week 2, 6 reps, week 3, like open set, or week 4 open set. And every time, like I couldn't hit this for 1 in the off season. I just hit it for 8. Like, oh wow, that's crazy. I can't believe that. Like I took tempo off, I took the fat grips off, I took the dumbbells away, and I put his A1 and do his like, C2 in a workout, something like that. And it's just, oh wow, what a crazy thing, man. You're setting PRs left and right. This program's great. That thing. And that always part of it too. But the other part is the psychological effect of in season wise, it's hard to train, it's hard to get stress on these kids, it's hard to maintain lean muscle mass. And when we look at a body composition analysis, looking at body fat versus lean muscle mass, majority of it's going to be predicated off what your upper body lean body or body composition is going to be, right? They're running, they're doing stuff every day. Like we don't see a whole lot of body compositional changes in thigh if you're doing a 7 site, but you'll see a lot of discrepancy in the upper body. And I think there's a development aspect of it too. So we start to focus more on it in season. We start to do a little bit more upper body. I really followed this idea of how do we time the endocrine system and immune system. So coming off a game, I do a low intensity, high volume. So I really want to get some sort of endocrine response, less CNS effect. But there's a body compositional effect as well. And I always thought if I can maintain lean muscle mass in the third quarter of the season, even to the fourth quarter and postseason, that our chances of success were higher because their immune system wasn't going to be as compromised. If you think about it, if we're putting on muscle, we're probably not getting sick. It's simple logic, but your body has a very linear vector, right? Building or breaking down. And if it's breaking down, everything kind of goes in that direction. So more upper body focus. So it's like a multivariate thing, but confidence, psychological aspect, physiologically, just placing more of an emphasis, hopefully more preventative there from the other end of it. And then, football, contact sports, male-driven sports in general, like if their shirts are feeling like they're bagging off of them or they're developing body fat in areas that they don't like, they're body conscious. I don't necessarily know if that's going into that postseason game of March Madness, them feeling at their best, So that was kind of the point of that. So it's fine to set PRs, but it's also too, it sets the precedent of every day I'm going to put you in a position to train as hard as humanly possible. I want you to just give everything you got for this 30 to 60 minutes that we have. And if I can say I've taken all away the restraints and the risk, you just put blinders on and train hard, go to practice, go to class, whatever you got to do, the chances of you being successful, it's like, just give me that. And I'd always say too, in season wise, like, look at the inventory of today. We got a movement prep, We got four exercises. We're going to spend the majority of the time in the first two. In that first two exercises, you got one hard set. Can you just give me one hard set of 5 today? Like, everything else is just consider it warm up and cool down. But I just want one really hard set. And if you start to condition that and they start like, I don't want to be here, it's before practice, before school, it's after practice, like, all I'm asking is just one hard set of 5. All this other stuff is just keeping tread on the tires, keeping you moving right, making sure that we're going to have a great workout and you can recover for tomorrow. But all I'm asking right now from a CNS input, from muscular abilities input, from maintaining of strength and power is just that one hard set. Can you just do that? It's going to take 10 seconds. Like, yeah, okay, that's great. Let's go to do that. And when we get to it, I'm going to be really ramped up and make sure that you know that this is time to turn it on. And I'm going to slowly start to pick up the intensity as we get to that work set, so to speak. And that conditioning of that, like, but it's the same token too. Like, I'll take care of you all year, but we need to have an agreement that training hard is a universal thing. We just need to know when to turn it on.
Thank you for
interesting about the lean mass. I recognized the lean mass too a couple of years ago. I recognized once your lean mass went down, it was like 5 to 7 pounds. They're a greater risk of injury. Like, those are the kind of some of the correlations that we all recognize too. So nutrition in season is extremely important. It's just eat. And when we've made a conscious decision of getting more food around them and them, the athletes being aware of just consuming a little bit more, they've been able to maintain lean mass pretty easy. Like, one we had, for example, a transfer, he said actually the other day, he's like, this is the best I've ever kept my weight up. He's like, last year I was like 170. He's like, now I'm at 180, and he's been consistent throughout the entire year. And he said, this is the strongest I've ever felt. Needless to say, like, the amount of training that we're doing right now is pretty minimal, because we're just in playoff mode right now. But it was just the feedback and the awareness that they actually receive themselves just from consuming more and by keeping their lean mass it's pretty cool. Because it increases their own self-confidence within themselves too.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. The thing that really dawned on me was when you start to evaluate limiting factors, and I work with swimming and diving at USC, and you look at the injury report, it was always outside the pool in the weight room, tripped over a curb, sprained their ankle, got hit by a car, fell off their skateboard. And it's like, oh, wow, okay, like I'm going to develop them in the pool, like learn hydrodynamics and what are the strokes they need to do, what's the event they have. And I'm like, wow, we need to do some just simple balance and proprioceptive work because these guys are fish out of water all day. And we're getting to, like, just doing simple balance work. And I treated them a lot like senior citizens in their warm up. And it wasn't a bad thing. It was like, you get hurt or we can't compete because you can't walk to class. Like, I need to do things like this in order to make sure that you're getting to the pool. And I don't care what we do in the pool as long as we get there. So that conversation around that, but the same thing too, of like you look at in fall sports, there's probably the biggest drop in performance around October, November, which is probably the peak of immune system compromised states. Like, they are in dorms, start to get locked in, they start closing windows, they start to get more around like people that are getting sick all the time. They're more compromised in that state. And you look at a football team with 100 guys like all together all the time. If one person gets sick, then it's a cluster effect. And then everyone else gets sick around them. Okay, well, we now know more about herd immunity than we ever needed to know about. But before that was a thing, if I'm knowing that we're putting on muscle or maintaining muscle, then chances are of us being able to combat that, either we get sick and we recover faster or we can avoid getting sick altogether. I might have a starter that wasn't going to be a starter playing longer into the season if he was going to get sick.
Awesome. I don't want to take up any more time of Tim's. Does anybody else have any like last minute questions for him?
No, I'm excited to read your book.
When's the third book coming out?
Good question. It's a good question, Spencer. It's a good question. I've been self-publishing and now I'm moving into another sphere. So, trying to get it published. It's been a lot longer a process, which is cool. If you guys read the first book, you probably got annoyed by a couple typos in there. Definitely want to work on that here going forward. It's all about content and pushing it out. And now it's like, the quality of the content. I just want to level up. So working with a publisher and just a lot more thorough. So the actual text is done, just kind of going through now the painstaking process of getting it published is the next phase. It's going to be my opus, though. A little shameless plug there, just get you excited.
Spencer's very excited.
Yeah, likewise.
Yeah, Tim, thank you so much for sharing, for taking time out of your day. And, we appreciate everything that you're able to give us. And it's nice to have you in our backyard now.
Yeah, Connecticut strong here.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you
All right,
very
guys.
much, Tim.
Thanks,
All right.
Tim.